that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven.
Wow, that is quite a passage of Scripture. Jesus' probably most famous sermon. And yet, not that familiar to us if you look at the way that the world is ordered and that most people participate in it. You would still, I'm going to go out on a limb here, you would still think that if Jesus showed up again and said this same kind of thing in English, it would be equally as troubling to those who heard it as it was to the original crowd. Jesus is talking about a counter kingdom, an un-kingdom, an anti-empire, an upside-down, inside-out approach to religion and life. It's pretty shocking stuff, actually. I want to put up a thing on a screen about 3 kinds of Christianities I want to talk about today. It's going to be our theme. Yep. So, we in Sunday school this morning, at brainstorming session at 9, we talked about this thing called liberation theology that has built into it what they call God's preferential treatment for the poor. And this theory says that God is primarily concerned with the marginalized, those who have been trampled by the systems, those who are left out and left behind, and those who are injured. That's where God is at work, is the margins and the underside of history. We, however, live in a time in American Christianity where pretty much the opposite is said, which is that God is clearly blessing the rich and the powerful and the famous, because otherwise how did they get that way? Right? And we should learn from them, and we should adopt their techniques and become more like them. Right? So this is actually the inverse of God's preferential treatment to the poor. We have in American Christianity a capitalist brand of Christianity, if you will, that says God rewards the rich and the faithful, right, with blessings. So we have God's preferential treatment for the rich and powerful. I'll be honest with you, I expected to get amens by this point in the sermon, but it's fine. We're not that kind of church. I get it. It's fine. I think I'm preaching the paint off the walls, though. But anyway, there's a third kind of Christianity that I have recently stumbled into, which is that I was having a conversation a couple months ago with somebody who said to me that Jesus is all about the center. And at first, it sounded so strange to my ears, I just thought to myself, that's the silliest thing I've ever heard. You're saying Jesus is a centrist. Yes, that Jesus would never exclude anyone from the table. So he holds the center. And I thought, I've never heard this articulated before. Because usually we get the either or, right? The preferential treatment for the poor or the preference for the rich and powerful. I've never heard anybody actually just say out loud and name, Christ is for the center. This is fascinating. And it bugged me. It really bugged me. But you should always pay attention when something really bothers you, but you can't figure out why. And I figured it out about 2 weeks ago. Just because I've never heard it said out loud before doesn't mean that's not exactly how I behave every damn day. Apparently, I believe Jesus is for the center. And I didn't know it. And that bugs me. I hate when there's things I believe that I've never said out loud, and then someone else says them out loud, and I go, that's dumb. And then I walk away and think, wait a minute, I think I do that. I'm pretty sure I do that. That's troubling. So these are the 3 kinds of Christianity, right, that I want to talk about today. But before we come back to that, I want to show you some other stuff. So in our book that we're reading, We Make the Road by Walking with Brian McLaren, for those of you who read chapter 27 this past week, and I know that you guys took it to Acapulco with you, right? So that's what you were reading poolside, I know that. Brian said an interesting thing. He's working off some authors, but there's two interesting quotes here I want to give you about this passage that we just read. So if you hear what Jesus is saying, listen to this. Do everything you can. This is the inverse of what we just heard in the Sermon on the Mount. Do everything you can to be rich and powerful. Toughen up and harden yourself against all feelings of loss. Measure your success by how much of the time you were thinking only of yourself and your own happiness. Be independent and aggressive, hungry and thirsty for higher status in the social pecking order. Now that seems ridiculous when it's up on a screen. But if we're real honest with each other, this tape plays in the back of most of our mind and media. We've been sold this version, a variation, if you will, of the gospel. In contrast to that, I want to put up this next one, which is a summary of this approach we're talking about. The poor and those in solidarity with them. This is who God is working amongst. Those who mourn, those who feel grief and loss. The nonviolent and the gentle. Those who hunger and thirst for common good and aren't satisfied with the status quo. The merciful and compassionate. Those characterized by openness, sincerity, and unadulterated motives. Those who work for peace and reconciliation. Those who keep seeking justice even when they're misunderstood and misjudged. So that's a pretty big contrast. And into that contrast, so let's put the other one back there, comes this third type of Christianity which says Christ is about the center, holding the tensions of our divided, right? Our polarized culture. That Christ is holding the tension to keep everyone at the table. So the question becomes, what is the good news? Right? The evangelion. The gospel. What is the gospel? What is salvation? Because if you believe in God's preferential treatment for the poor, then salvation is when people are liberated and emancipated out of the oppressive systems that have trampled them and held them down. That's a very different gospel than, say, what many of you may have been sold, which is that if you pray one prayer at the end of a church service or at youth camp, that you alone will go to heaven after you die, and thus you're saved. That's an American version of the gospel. But there's this middle thing that says the good news is that God is for all of us. Those are three very different expectations of God at work in the world. Three very different explanations of what the end is, what the goal is. And three very different populations that we say God is at work in. You see why I wanted to talk about this today? Charlie's going to come to the table in a second. But before that, I want to show you two things as I have been preparing for this over the last month. Two screenshots that I want to show you that I found. The first is a Serbian proverb. For those of you who can't read it, I'll read it for you. Be humble, for you are made of the earth. Be noble, for you are made of the stars. I'm going to let you sit with that for a second. Look, we're all just dust anyway, right? We're just dirt. Don't get up on your high horse. Don't be too impressed. We're just mud. Here's the other thing, though. There is something glorious about you. Something eternal and divine at work in you. You are made of the stars. Both of those things are true of all of us. I'm going to phrase it a different way. Here's C.S. Lewis from The Weight of Glory. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. It is immortals with whom we joke, work with, marry, snub, exploit. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. You are the handiwork, the masterpiece of the divine. There's something truly special about your neighbor. And if Christ is for us all, then we need to be very concerned about those who have been left out and left behind, marginalized and run over. So we're going to talk about this in a second. I'm going to get Charlie's take on this. And then later we're going to come to the table, and we're not going to talk about it. We're going to enact it and embody it. So I'm going to ask if the ushers will come and collect our offering while you gather your thoughts. Joey's going to play some music behind, and then Charlie's going to come to the table.